The midday sun turned the steel beams into searing radiators. Robert wiped sweat from his eyes, the taste of copper and dust filling his mouth as he twisted another length of wire. Around him, the site hummed with the rhythmic thud of hammers and the grind of heavy machinery. He sat on a stack of lumber for a break, his lungs heavy with the heat. Beside him, an older electrician slumped over an empty thermos, his hands trembling slightly as he set it down. The man stared past the unfinished walls, his face etched with the exhaustion of 40 years on the job. "If I could start over," the older man muttered, his voice cutting through the noise of the site, "I would buy assets instead of things." He tapped his chest. "I spent my life buying the wrong things, and now I have nothing to show but these tired hands." Robert looked at his own palms, raw and calloused, then looked back at the man. The words hit him harder than any tool he had ever held. He watched the man retreat back into the shadows of the frame, leaving Robert alone with the realization that he was building a future for someone else while his own remained empty. The decision took hold in that silence. Robert did not wait for the shift to end. He left the site, the smell of dust still clinging to his skin, and walked straight to the nearest public computer. His heart hammered against his ribs as he navigated the brokerage screens. The interface felt alien, a grid of numbers and buttons that promised a different kind of labor. He typed his information with deliberate, slow strokes, his fingers stiff from the day's work. When the final prompt appeared, his palms were slick. He hovered his mouse over the buy button. One share, a fraction of his monthly earnings. He clicked. His hand shook so violently he had to grip the desk edge to steady himself. The confirmation screen blinked green. It was done. He sat back, the hum of the computer fan filling the small room. He stared at the screen, watching the digital record of his first asset. He made a vow then, silent and absolute. No matter the market, no matter the world, no matter the temptation, he would return every single month. He would buy one share. No exceptions, no excuses. The path was set. The next month began just like the last. Robert returned to the dust and the high-voltage cables, his routine unchanged. Around him, the atmosphere on the site shifted. His crewmates arrived in fresh trucks, the paint gleaming under the harsh morning light. They spoke of weekend trips to the coast and expensive gear they had financed with their latest checks. The conversations were loud, filled with the excitement of immediate reward. Robert listened, his calloused hands moving with precision as he stripped insulation from a heavy wire. He felt the pull of their lifestyle, the ease of simply spending. But then he remembered the digital confirmation from his account. He reached into his pocket, feeling the small, worn notebook where he tracked his progress. Every time a coworker showed off a new purchase, Robert mentally added another share to his tally. The isolation grew as the weeks turned into months. They invited him to join their lavish outings, but he declined, citing work or exhaustion. It was a lie, but it protected his resolve. He saw their trucks lose their shine, their excitement fade into the next round of payments, while his own portfolio grew, unseen and silent. He was building a different kind of structure, one that required no mortar, only the steady, unyielding pressure of his monthly commitment. The market did not stay calm. One Tuesday, the news cycles turned red, and the panic hit the construction site like a sudden power surge. Men stood around the lunch table, eyes glued to their phones, voices rising in distress as their account balances dipped. They talked of selling, of cutting losses, of the looming disaster. Robert heard them, but he did not look up from his work. He saw the dip not as a failure, but as a technical adjustment. That evening, he opened his account. The numbers were down, the loss visible in bold, aggressive font. He did not hesitate. He placed his monthly order, buying more for the same amount of capital. When the market eventually turned and began its ascent, the site returned to its usual rhythm of spending. The coworkers cheered the recovery, feeling rich again, but Robert stayed the course. He treated his portfolio like a complex circuit board, knowing that every connection mattered regardless of the current load. He ignored the headlines. He ignored the frantic energy of the doubters. When the market soared to new heights, he placed his monthly order with the exact same rhythm he used during the crash. He was not gambling on the movement of the price. He was investing in the architecture of the system. He kept his eyes on the long-term flow, unmoved by the temporary surges or the sudden, sharp drops in current. 10 years had vanished into the rhythm of the work week. In the parking lot, staring at his balance on a dim screen. The portfolio remained small, a quiet accumulation of digital lines that felt disconnected from the decades of labor in his hands. It was a slow, grinding process, and the weight of the years began to press against him. Then, a car pulled into the lot. It was sleek, polished, and hummed with a low, aggressive power. His coworkers gathered around, running hands over the hood, praising the leather and the speed. Robert walked past it, his own boots heavy with sight dust. He looked at the price tag in his mind, calculating the years of monthly shares that single purchase would erase. The temptation was a physical ache, a sudden, sharp desire to stop waiting and start feeling the comfort of something new. He sat in his own truck and opened his brokerage app. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. He asked himself, "Do I want this today or freedom tomorrow?" The image of the luxury car lingered, but he closed his eyes and saw the compounding growth instead. He set his phone aside, gripped the steering wheel, and made the choice. He would not buy the car. He would buy more shares. The decision was absolute. The cycles continued, turning months into years, until the calendar hit the 2-decade mark. Robert maintained his rhythm, logging in every month to place his order, but the internal architecture of his portfolio had begun to warp. He sat in the side office, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. He looked at the monthly report. For the first time, the dividends earned by his existing shares were larger than the cash he had deposited from his own paycheck. The machine had reached a critical threshold. He checked the numbers again, tracing the line of growth with a calloused finger. Every cent he had sacrificed had been a gear, and now those gears were spinning in unison, generating their own velocity. He did not need to add as much as he once did. The system was doing the heavy lifting for him. The compounding effect had shifted from a slow crawl to a steady, rhythmic climb. He watched the total rise, not through his own labor alone, but through the inherent momentum of the capital he had accumulated. The act of saving had transformed into a self-sustaining engine. He stood up, pushed his chair back, and looked out at the construction site. The wires he installed in the buildings would eventually degrade, but the connections he built in his account were only gaining strength. The shift was complete. The final shift was the hardest. His muscles burned with a fatigue that settled deep into his bones, and his eyes felt heavy with the grit of the day. Robert drove home in silence, his hands still vibrating from the power tools. He entered the house, dropped his gear by the door, and slumped into his chair. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the laptop he left open on the table. He reached out, his calloused fingertips hovering over the keys. He had made this login a ritual for 30 years, a habit carved into his life as deeply as the labor in his palms. He clicked the account tab. The page loaded, the cursor pulsed, and then the numbers appeared. He blinked, pulled back, and leaned in closer. The total was not what he expected. He refreshed the page, watching the browser bar load, but the digits remained fixed. It was a 7-figure sum. The air in the room seemed to thin. He sat motionless, his work boots still pressed into the floorboards, the weight of the reality dawning on him. The lines on the screen were no longer just data. They were the physical manifestation of 3 decades of discipline. He had spent his life wiring buildings for others, and now he had wired his own escape. The cursor continued to blink on the screen, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the darkness. Robert did not move. His work boots were caked with the dust of the final site, the leather stiff and worn. He looked at his hands, resting heavy on the table, noticing the deep lines etched into his skin from years of gripping pliers and pulling copper. The silence of the house was absolute. There were no deadlines, no foreman calling for progress, and no alarms set for the pre-dawn hours. He felt the weight of 30 years of labor dissolve, replaced by a sudden, terrifying lightness. He stood up slowly, his knees popping in the quiet, and walked to the window. Outside, the world continued its frantic pace, but he was no longer a gear in its machinery. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass. The independence he had chased through thousands of small, unglamorous decisions was no longer a goal on a screen. It was the air in his lungs. It was the ability to stand still while the rest of the world raced. He reached out and closed the laptop, the screen going black, and for the first time in his adult life, He did not worry about what tomorrow would demand of his hands. Robert turned from the window back to the desk. He traced the grain of the wood, his mind drifting back to the skeleton of every building he had ever wired. He remembered the smell of ozone and the sting of stripped insulation. He had spent his life connecting copper strands to power sources, ensuring that buildings could breathe, light up, and function. All those years, he thought he was merely building walls for others. He had been so focused on the conduit, the junction boxes, and the load calculations that he missed the larger blueprint. The same logic he used on the site, the patient, step-by-step assembly of a complex system was exactly what he had applied to his own life. He had treated his portfolio like a circuit board, knowing that every single connection mattered. He had laid the wires of his independence one by one, month by month, in the shadows of his daily labor. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was the same relentless, unglamorous technical precision he used to thread wire through steel studs. He had spent 30 years wiring buildings for others. And in that process, he had quietly, methodically, wired his own freedom into existence. The machine was finished. The power was on. Years later, people would come to him, their eyes wide with the hunger for a shortcut. They asked for the secret ticker symbol, the insider tip, the magic system that turned a construction worker into a man of means. Robert would listen to their frantic questions, then hold up his hands. He spread his fingers, showing them the rough, thick skin and the permanent dark stains of copper dust etched into the creases of his palms. He didn't offer a lecture on market trends or complex mathematics. He simply looked them in the eye and said, "I never missed a month." That was the sum of it. No hidden genius, no sudden stroke of fortune. Wealth, he would tell them, was never a sprint meant for the swift or the lucky. It was a long, unglamorous series of small choices stacked against the ticking of a clock. It was the grit of showing up when the market fell, and the discipline of staying quiet when the market soared. He turned his back on the questions, his palms still showing the evidence of his work, and walked away. The lesson remained behind. Anyone can build a fortress, but most lack the patience to lay the first stone, and the next, until the wall stands on its own.